as a whole. Our conversation will comprise roughly the first hour of our program, after which we'll go to a question and answer format. For those of you watching, if you'd like to ask a question of our experts, you can type it into the chat feature at any time. And when we get to that portion of the program, we will ask as many of your questions as we have time for. Now I would like to introduce our experts. Julian S. Newman is the founder and CEO of Culture Creative, a leading national and award-winning diversity and inclusion consulting firm based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Mr. Newman is an inspiring, charismatic speaker and subject matter expert who has spoken to more than 100,000 people internationally during the last 20 years. Additionally, he's worked with more than 100 companies nationally, including the ad agency Leo Burnett, Grand Rapids Police Department, Michigan State University, and various school districts and nonprofits throughout Michigan. Timothy T. Williams Jr. is a leading national expert on police procedure, use of force, and wrongful convictions. He has more than 29 years of active law enforcement experience and over 46 years of experience working in the criminal justice system. Mr. Williams proudly served in the Los Angeles Police Department as a detective, ultimately ascending to the rank of senior detective supervisor and retiring from the elite robbery homicide division. Mr. Williams is currently the founder and CEO of T.T. Williams Jr. Investigations, a company based in Los Angeles, California that provides industry-leading expertise in state and federal cases throughout the United States related to police procedure, use of force, and wrongful convictions. So I want to welcome everybody in the audience, and I'd like to welcome our two experts. Tim, did you want to say a few words of welcome?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody on board for this meaningful discussion that we're going to have this afternoon. I just kind of want to lay a foundation, if I could, as it relates to law enforcement, so that we can usher in to this discussion with a little bit more of an understanding. In the early forms of American policing, law enforcement began with slave patrols. And as I was doing my research, I ran across a oath that was given to the slave patrol patrollers. And this was authored by Chelsea Hansen on July 10th, 2019, on her blog, On the Beat. And the oath says this, I'm gonna read it verbatim. It says, I, in the name of the person, do swear that I will, as a searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. Now, this is the oath that the slave patrols took. And as you look through the history of law enforcement, this being part of the genesis of law enforcement, you will see that through the discussions that some of the same systemic racism is still, not maybe, but is still present today. Some of the same systemic tactics that was used back then are still in place today. And we will see and discuss this issue of what implicit and explicit bias looks like and how it can be applied in our lives and in law enforcement as a whole. So we want you to put your seatbelts on, enjoy the ride, and we will all learn something from this discussion. Adam?
All right, thank you. Julian, did you want to say a few words and from the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging standpoint, some introductory points and some definitions that we'll be working with today?
Thank you, Adam. I think, one of the things that I think is really important is we're talking about policing, we're talking about bias. The reality is all of us have bias. It doesn't make us a bad person because we have bias. And so if you see a tall person who's a man, if we're not tall, we're probably inclined to ask them, do you play basketball? Okay, so that's a bias that we have for tall men. If I were to yell peanut butter, the response would probably be jelly. And so we have these biases that we all carry, and they're not necessarily bad, but they're the manifestation of those internalized messages that we have when we have a conversation with our family, our friends, magazine, movies, television shows that we've watched. And so bias is something that we all have, but it's implicit bias that's unconscious, the non-thinking things that dig into our subconscious that influence how we feel, what we believe, and then how we behave. And so when we get into that process, those negative biases, when we see a certain group as being a certain way, that's when it gets us into issues and trouble. And in the context of policing and law, where we can have some of the things that Mr. Williams talked about a little bit earlier. And it's going to be the foundation of our discussion today.
And so building on that, now, Julian, you are a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging expert. Can you tell us what do you do as a DEIB expert? And what is the relevance of your work? What is the application of your work when it comes to police procedure and wrongful convictions?
Well, thank you, Adam. Well, a DEIB expert works with individuals and organizations to help their policies, their procedures, their framework to create an atmosphere where everyone can be their best, do their best, and achieve the highest level of their human potential. Like I talked about, all of us have bias, and organizations, because they're made up of people, they carry those biases into their institutions and their structures. And so when we're conscious of those things, then we have the opportunity to create atmospheres and framework to supersede, alleviate, and minimize. The reason why someone like myself is relevant in this conversation is because bias is a people issue, and policemen and women are people before they wear the badge. And so as we bring ourselves to whatever work that we do, in this context, law enforcement, we bring our biases to the table. And one of the paradoxes of bias is when we're aware of our bias and our blindness, we can minimize it. When we're unaware of it or we deny it, it actually expands and grows. And so as we look forward in the future and looking to bring a transformation, reformation to how we police, how we interact with our community, as we become more aware of those biases, then we can do a better job in terms of policing and protecting our communities.
So, Tim, you've done a lot of work over the years assessing cases for potential wrongful convictions, convictions that have taken place in decades past. As an expert on police procedure, police practices, and wrongful convictions, how do you go about, are you looking for bias in the investigation? And if so, how do you find it? And what materials are you looking at to try to find it?
Well, as I analyze these cases, the wrongful conviction cases, and those who have historical ramifications to them, I look at the geography of where these crimes occurred. In the law enforcement arena, when officers police in minority communities, Black and brown communities, it's a different type of policing than you'll see in the white communities. So therefore, I figured the geography out. And this is not unique to California or to my department, my ex-department, but to law enforcement throughout the country, because I see the same systemic issues throughout the country. The second thing is I look at the officers that are involved here. When I say officers, detectives And for the most part, they're in historical, they're white. And you see that there's a certain type of abrasiveness or approach to the investigation, if you will. I had a case where it was involving teenagers, Black teenagers, and they picked up some kids, and they got them to coerce them into saying whatever they wanted them to say to get a closure on the case. As I reviewed the case, the suspect was there at the crime scene when they were doing the investigation. Well, you know, if you study law enforcement, if you study investigations, you know that a lot of times suspects will return to the scene of the crime, and during the course of an investigation. And in fact, the detectives talked with him. And if they had done the job they were supposed to do, they would have solved the crime within 1 or 2 days. But now they got these kids. And I get the impression, I don't get the impression, is that any minority kid will do. And guess what happened? The state's attorney filed on them. They were convicted by a trial, and they were sentenced to prison for life. Well, then I get involved in the case some years later, and I see all these nuances, all these problems, and I'm testifying in deposition on these cases, and I'm bringing out these cultural and bias issues during the course of my deposition. Well, the long and short of it, by the time I got the kids, these guys were already out of prison, and they were getting ready to. They were suing the department for being wrongfully convicted, and they end up getting millions of dollars. But the thing is that if you do it right, if you do the investigations right on the front end, if you don't bring your biases to the minority community, but keep your investigation as it relates to the crime that's at hand, and not try to put it on any minority or any kid, where with the answer what any kid or anybody will do to get this case off, then you will start seeing changes in the area of biasness as it relates to law enforcement.
And so what are some of the things you can see? You know, we talk about, when you're looking at the police reports, what we talk about as the murder book in Los Angeles, the reports of the investigation, what are some of the things that you can see right away that start to give you the idea that there was bias involved in the investigation?
Well, right away, I can see how the investigation is approached by the officers who listen to the tapes of interviews, and it's a shouting match. You know, the white detective comes in there and he talks down to the suspect, and now next thing you know, it's the shouting match. It's totally disrespect. It's not the way you interview or interact with a suspect. I don't care how egregious the crime is. Number one. Number two, and the first thing when I analyze this case, the first thing I can tell is whether a person's been trained or not, what kind of experience they have. Because if they're going in there, the shortcuts have shortcuts, and you're seeing all these things, and a seasoned detective or a seasoned officer would not make these types of mistakes. The third thing I see is incompetent supervision, and the biasness goes up the chain of command, because you know you have an investigation that's flawed from the beginning, you have an interview that's flawed from the beginning, and you have supervision that just rubber stamps what's going on. Then you translate that over to the courts, where the state's attorney or the district attorney is looking at this, and now you have you have that bias seeping in to the court system, and by defining it, then you go to the court, and then you see some decisions that may have a bias based upon the decision. Well, you know, this is a minority, you know, this is the minority community. This is what they do in that community. They, who is they? Well, that's the brown and your black defendant. And or you may have a judge, which I heard in a case that was a murder case that was being tried a third time. Well, I don't want to hear this again. Well, it's not for you to hear it again. It's for the jury to hear it again. You're not trying this case. This is not a court trial. This is a jury trial. And I'm listening and watching this stuff, and I'm seeing bias right before my eyes, and from the bench. And so, you know, again, it's an issue that translates itself from the very beginning of the case to the from the patrol, the first responders, to the investigation, to the filing, to the bench and the outcome of the case. And then 30 years later, you get the case out of. You call me, and we're trying to figure this stuff out.
All right. I'm going to give you both a hypothetical to think about and talk about. Last summer, we all saw the death of George Floyd and how it sparked international protests and mobilization around the issue of police brutality. Let's say you received a call today from a police department where a very similar incident had taken place, hypothetically. And the person on the other end of the line said, we'd like to hire you to come down here, evaluate this situation in our department, and design a program to fix it. What would you do? How would you evaluate it? And then how would you go about making the necessary changes in the department? You both have very different, you're coming from different areas professionally. So I'd love to hear those questions answered by both of you. Let's start with Tim. How would you evaluate the situation when you got on the ground there, and what could you do to change it?
First of all, I would want to hear from the community. If I'm gonna bring change, I got to know what the community is saying. So I would have a forum or a community forum that I would be sitting down listening to what the concerns are. The second thing is that I would look at the organization from left to right, top to bottom. When I say left to right, I mean from the recruit or the person applying to come onto the department, and to the retiree on the right, and then from the top, from the chief's position, all the way down to the probationary officer who's on the job. The thing is that, you know, you have the things you find and we talk about reform, but community doesn't really understand what reform looks like. And reform is tearing something down and building something up that will meet the needs of not only the community, but the criminal justice system as a whole. You look at individuals coming in, they are being interviewed by retirees. You look at those who are taking interviews, they sit before either active officers like myself, because I've done this before, or retirees. So what you're doing, they're coming before gatekeepers, and you having the same mentality that's coming in, absent certain core values that are needed: respect for community, reverence for life, and empathy for those that you come in contact with. You don't learn that stuff in the departments. You got to bring that stuff in. Then you look at the organization as a whole, the infrastructure of the organization. You look at, you know, what are they learning in the academy? What are they learning from the training officers? What are the supervision doing? What are they winking at, and what are they not doing? What is management doing? What are they're not applying not in compliance with? Had a case where there was some racial bias issues that were at play. Well, this particular agency had a requirement of a training every year on implicit bias. Well, guess what? As I reviewed the training records of these individuals, the policy says one thing, and in actuality, they were getting training by every 3 or 4 years. They didn't care whether they got it or not. So the thing is that, so that's a management problem there. So you will bring as a consultant, I would look at all these issues. I would look at reforming the organization, changing the organization where you will experience constitutional policing. You will experience building up the community, working to have a more closer relationship with the community and law enforcement, that particular law enforcement agency, and developing programs and systems. Again, the key word is systems, putting systems in place that will break they will break the trend of what we have seen from the time I was a child, from the time my parents were coming up until you see today. You're talking about George Floyd. George Floyd is nothing new in the minority and more specifically the Black community. The community's been talking about this for decades. Technology has changed, now it's capturing it. The community already know what was going on. Now you're seeing it because of technology. So the thing is that we got to go in there and make meaningful change and doing some very constructive things. I'm gonna let Julian talk.
Well, I think one of the first thing I would do is I would call Tim. That's one of the first thing I would do because there is, as he said very well, the policing component, the evaluation from left to right, as he said, from the context of what are the policies and procedures specifically in relation to effective policing or the lack thereof. Where I would step in is what happens. Let's deal with the person that before they put on the badge, and let's assess the context of this crisis. Because when we get into George Floyd, we look at these seismic moments of cultural clashes that become the epicenter of so much passion and unrest and anger and pain. There is always more of a why behind the what that we see. And so let's dig into, let's assess the people that are policemen and women. Let's talk about what was the decision-making process in relation to why this decision was made or not made. Let's assess and let's try to backtrack. Let's dig into the past and find out why did this happen. But I think it's important for us to not just talk about what happened or why it happened, but what we can do going forward. This is not just the work of, if I will use the analogy of hazardous material cleanup. And so often we talk about these issues, they are crisis. So we're in this process of trying to recreate the past and piece things together and remove the bad. And that is a part of this. But it's also a part of this work in terms of building policies and procedures and frameworks for us to build a different future. And so where do we want to be after we deal with the trauma and the crisis and the calamity and the disconnection of the present? And just like Tim said, the importance of having the voice of the community. And this isn't just about those that wear the badge. It's about those that they are sworn to serve and protect. And I believe if I could boil down the work that I do, and I would say by extension, Tim does, it's really about creating a bridge of relationship, common understanding, and communication. When we are able to foster effective relationships, then we're able to navigate crisis and misunderstanding at a higher level. It's so many of these tragic instances at the core is not having a connection, communication, common understanding, and a relationship. When I have a relationship, then I behave one way. When I am leading or I'm acting out of negative bias, then I approach it another. So what I would do beyond calling Tim is after the assessment phase in trying to create a context for the crisis, after all of that, we would build some framework to establish a different pathway for a brand new future. So these crises and these calamities don't happen anymore.
If I can add, the thing is that as the team of Newman and Williams, or Williams and Newman, come together at a municipality, you gotta, as you assess, you gotta bring stakeholders to the table. Because if you don't bring the stakeholders to the table, then what you're doing, you're bringing sand to the beach and really get nothing accomplished. When I say the stakeholders, I'm talking about the faith community. I'm talking about the criminal justice community that's in place in that community. the business community, the education community, in the media, and all these things go on because they are the stakeholders. They are what make up the community, and without them, these programs will never get legs and move and do the things that it's intended to do. Education is a problem in the minority communities. You got to talk about that. There is the faith community. They have a church almost in every corner in the minority communities. You got to deal with that. So, and the list goes on. So you got to bring your stakeholders to the table and have a meaningful discussion and have a coherent plan moving forward.
So if I can back out just a little bit and just to get down to very practical terms, Julian, you work as a consultant mostly with corporations and universities, is what I understand. How do you, in very practical terms, get this information when you go into a place that's hired you? Are we talking about interviewing everybody? Or are we talking about going through their documents? And I also wonder, I assume that there are, what are the kinds of incidents brought on by bias that you see in corporations, as opposed to, obviously the situations like we just described? I assume it's a different outcome. So what kinds of situations bring you in?
So there are proactive moves, and then there's reactive ones. And so reactive is someone in a community or business communication that was insensitive. They used the N-word. They posted something. They of building teams or the hiring or recruiting practices, there was not a representative of the community or the vision of what we're trying to accomplish, trying to be a diverse and inclusive and belonging organization. So there are some crises that can be very messy, that can lead to lawsuits and litigation and things of that nature. And then there's proactive decision that says, okay, we want to do a better job and we want to avoid some of these negative crises that we see some of our contemporaries or some of the other businesses or organizations that are in our industry. And so we want to put things together that are going to ensure that we stay on the right pathway. In relation to how do we assess, there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can do that through one-on-one interviews. You can do that through anonymous assessments that you over email or digitally. There are multiple ways in order to do that. But the real goal is try to get an honest assessment of the voice, the personality, and the belief system of the organization beyond the niceties and some of the things that we want to put on our website and things of that nature that we believe in. So some of it is reactive. Something bad has happened, and we are trying to clean it up and do something in relation to that particular crisis. And then there's other work that is proactive. And we don't have a crisis. We don't want a crisis. We want to do a better job of accomplishing our mission and vision as an organization.
And Tim, is the methodology for getting that information at something like a police department, is that different?
Well, one of the things is when I was working at the staff level, I was working Detective Services Group. It's now called Detective Bureau. I looked at all of the issues as it relates to detective functions on the department. I worked a lot with risk management, and I wanted to see some of the lawsuits that were coming through. On the management level, how you examine things are through audits. So as I was seeing things coming through, there was a common thread of why these lawsuits were coming about. So I started audits in the 4 bureaus to help address these issues. Well, after the wailing and gnashing of teeth, because they didn't want to do the audits, but they were coming down from the staff level, so they had to do them. We finally started to look at, starting to see some things, and we basically got some answers, and we made sure that training was implemented, like in the detective schools, detective supervisor schools, the roll calls, patrol, sergeant schools, and so on and so forth, as well as the management level, to start mitigating some of this conduct that we were seeing, that was costing the city millions of dollars. So after a while, it doesn't happen right away, but after a while, you start seeing things decline. So how you measure it, you examine it through audits, and then you assess it. And how you assess it, you see if there is, working with the risk management, with the city attorney's office, you wanted to see if there was a decline of things that were coming through. So that's how, on the managerial side, on the management side, that's how I would do it, and it's how I would suggest it would be done once you get Williams and Newman to come and look at your organization, you see, and you get a holistic approach on that, and until you examine the organization, there is nothing that's going to change. I mean, you have a new CEO coming into the organization. A smart CEO would hire a consultant firm to come in to let him or her know what they got and how they can address it and how they can deal with it, and so they can have a positive outcome and not have a Julian come in when you have a lawsuit that's pending that's costing millions of dollars, whereas you can get them on the front end, get minds changed and hearts changed, if you will. I call that the conversion experience, so that you won't have a problem on the backside.
And so, Julian, you started by talking about certain kinds of biases that are ingrained in us that we sort of bring to the table. I assume in all of these situations that a lot of the biases we're talking about are deeply ingrained in the people that hold them. So once you've identified these, what is the actual program for trying to eradicate them or mitigate them?
One of the first things after saying, hey, we all have bias, key is allowing us or creating mechanisms in order to see our bias. And so we all have a certain lane. One of the things that we talk about is expanding the individual's as well as the organizational's bandwidth. And so I think there's at least a few of us, I think all of us are old enough to remember the early internet. But early in the internet, you could do three things. You could talk on the phone, you could check your email, or you could surf the pixelated web. That's all. You could do three things, and you could only do one of those three things at the same time. And so the reason why we were limited in our ability is because the bandwidth was so narrow. We had, the old modems that had the real loud sound and all this type of stuff. But over the course of time, bandwidth is increased. And now we have the opportunity to have conversations that we have right now that feels more like the Jetsons, than the Flintstones from back in the day. And so with that expanded bandwidth, we can have discussions like this. We can post, we can do videos, we can share videos, we can argue with strangers on the internet. We can do all sorts of different things because the bandwidth is increased. And because the bandwidth is increased, it's given us more options. When we're talking about cultural bandwidth, individually as well as organizationally, it's our ability to navigate difference at a higher level. And part of expanding our cultural bandwidth individually and organizationally is not assessing, but taking inventory of the biases that we have. I realize that negative experiences with groups of people can negatively influence how I project that negative experience on other people that have nothing to do with that. And so there's a real personal space of evaluation. Where am I at in the story? And am I projecting on others my own unprocessed pain? And so this whole process of becoming more diverse, equitable, inclusive, belonging organizations isn't just something that you get in a workbook. It isn't just something that you get, okay, we're going to send this email, you're going to read through it, and you're good to go. This is really assessing not just how we lead, but how we live and what we've learned and what we need to unlearn. And so the work that we do is to be able to
talk about the policies and procedures, but not to neglect the person that's implementing all of those things.
And so, Tim, my understanding is that police departments are traditionally rather resistant to change and rather resistant to being told to do things a new way. What do you do about getting the buy-in of the people at the organization that you're trying to change?
Well, before the Justice Department comes in and slaps a consent decree on them, we want them to be proactive and do the right thing. Let me give you an example. I was at a supervisory school that was put on by Peace Officer Standards and Training in California. We had supervisors from all across the state. And it was, I think it was in my class, it was about 35 to 40. I think 40 was the tops. We had 12 books to read to analyze and write our assessments or evaluate, or not so much a book report, but analyze and write a report on the book. Well, one of the books was written by a Black Panther. And man, I tell you, you thought you asked somebody to slap them up. And the whites refused to read it. And to the point where the facilitator says, if you don't do it, you're out of here. And I'm going to contact your chief of police. Well, with that statement, you got their attention because they know when, you're killing their career for mobility. And so they didn't want that. So they read the book. Here is the transformation. They read the book and they were more actively involved in the discussions. They were more actively involved. Hey, I get this. They were just like a pastor said, there was conversion amongst these individuals, these white supervisors who did not even want to pick up a Black Panther book, a book written by a Black Panther, or even have it in their car, in their library at home, or anywhere else for that matter. And they got into it and they understood and started making some meaningful recommendations and say, hey, when I get back, I'm going to do A, B, C, D, and E. And so these are the things that, in my opinion, you've got to, to convince these individuals, say, we got to look at this as a unit. This is not about you. It's not about me, but it's about the organization. It's about the community to make this a better place. And we need your leadership, to be effective. And once you get in there and read things that perhaps you may be uncomfortable with, you may be more comfortable than the person who authored it. So the thing is that you've got to go in there with an open mind. It's like investigations. If you go in there with tunnel vision, you come out with a whole bunch of issues that may be wrong. So you can't go in there with the tunnel vision. You go in there with an open mind and get that conversion experience, if you will.
And Julian, is that, it seems like what Tim's describing is a very emotionally charged situation. Is it similar in different settings when it's not a law enforcement setting? And what methods do you use to get buy-in in those situations?
I think, Tim used the word uncomfortable. And one of the things I try to do in my work is to create a comfortable place to have an uncomfortable conversation. And so it isn't life or death. Because I think all of us want to be right rather than wrong. Humility and deference to say, you know what? I didn't get this. Is looking and leading beyond the label, and have those, quick assessment. Okay, hey, this is what I'm looking at. This is what this means. But the reality is, there's a whole lot of context to the label that we may be looking at. And so we've all got it wrong at different times, but it takes humility, deference, and courage, if you will, to be able to come to grips with the fact that, you know what, maybe I need to do this differently. When we're talking about different organizations, particularly if we're in an educational space, how it affects young people, how it affects their future, how it affects future professionals and how they interact and engage in the world. We are living in polarized times. And so the thing that we really try to emphasize is moving beyond the points of polarization to be able to see the problem from a different perspective. For example, have a problem, and we could say the problem is a Z. And perspectives. We have X on one side of the problem of Z, and we have Y on the other side. Y is looking at X through the prism of Z, and X is looking at Y through the prism of Z, and there's a distortion there. And so there's an association. Whenever I see X, you know what? They are connected to the problem. Whenever I see Y, they're connected to the problem. So this distortion creates an atmosphere where we're just doing this polarization tug of war back and forth. And we're just pulling back and forth. And we're not solving a problem. We're just blaming the other side for the problem. But good leadership doesn't blame, good leadership solves. So what we try to do is, instead of having Y pulling X and X pulling Y, looking at themselves through the distorted prism of Z, how about X and Y getting on the same side and using their collective energy, perspective, and experience to be able to solve the problem of Z? And so we may not be in complete agreement, but we can move into a higher level of alignment. And so the work that we do is trying to move beyond you're right, they're wrong, this is this, this is that. But how can we use our collective creativity, innovation, our humanity to be able to solve these problems that are facing all of us? That if we don't solve them, all of us suffer, but if we do, all of us benefit. That's really at the core of what we do in the diversity inclusion space that isn't directly connected to law enforcement like Tim.
Well, let me ask you both. You've both been doing this a long time now. In your respective areas of this conversation, are you seeing trends toward elimination of bias? Are you seeing things get worse, or are you seeing things get better? Tim, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, I don't, in the area of the criminal justice, I don't see any change happening as of right now. I've lived through the Rodney King riots. I lived, and 28 years later, I lived through the George Floyd insurrection, which was a worldwide outcry. And until you put the proper people at the table, I say stakeholders, and you have the proper people away from the cameras and doing the things that need to be done, you will not see a change. As you see, as I was talking to a colleague a couple of days ago, what is unique about the George Floyd phenomenon and the Rodney King phenomenon? Now we see quietness. We don't see discussions anymore. Every so often you see a peak and it's talking about criminal justice reform. Then you see another peak, then you're talking about defunding a police department. Then you see another peak, and then you see prosecutors trying to be progressive, if you will. But no one is sitting to the table. And until someone sits at the table and have a meaningful discussion, nothing will be done. And you say, well, we could bring some chiefs. I am against having stars and bars at the table that I'm sitting at, because if stars and bars are doing what they were supposed to be doing, then we wouldn't have the problems that we're having now. So the thing is that, you know, leadership, in my position, I'm just going to say it. They're absent without leave. You see, and the reason why I'm saying that, because we come across the same issues every 2.5, every decade and a half. Okay, or every 2 decades, and nothing changes. So you've got to be visionary. You got to be a visionary. You've got to I'm going to use a term that you won't use, Julian. You got to make them uncomfortable. You see, and if you're uncomfortable, then you're going to try to get comfortable. And if you have shoes on that are too small, you can't walk. Well, what's your goal is to find shoes that fit, so that you can be comfortable. So we want to find shoes that will fit. And how you do that, you set the proper people at the proper table. You look at the advances in law enforcement. They weren't made by staff officers. They were made by rank and file. Your DARE program, that wasn't a staff vision. That was an officer's vision. And I know where that came from. The domestic violence program from LAPD, that wasn't created by a staff officer. That was created by myself. You see? So the thing is that, you know, I get the impression, I don't get the impression, the vision is not coming from the staff. It's coming from the rank and file. And you got to realize where the rubber meets the road, because these are the folk that are out there. They know what the concerns are. They know how things can be made and how things can change. So the thing is that, you know, you've got to, you know, the administration, when the administration, the presidents, they put together these commissions and all this other stuff, and you have all these CEOs and coming to the table, and guess what happens? Another 4 or 5 years, another 12 years, you're having the same commission doing the same thing that was done 8 years, 12 years ago. Why? Because you had the wrong people at the table.
Julian, what do you see along those lines outside of the law enforcement arena or within the law enforcement arena?
I think in terms of the cyclical nature of racial injustice that we've seen in recent days and how that's connected to the past. So I definitely think we can make a case that things are as bad as they were, or in some cases worse. I also would say, because of the intensity of the crisis and the worse, if you will, people are being challenged to be better. And so there are places and spaces where I'm having conversations, the work that we're doing with different corporations or nonprofits or in criminal justice, that people are saying that we have to do better. We have to bring reform. We have to bring transformation, because we don't want the future to be like the past that we've inherited. And so there is great cause for concern. I also believe that there is evidence that there are people that are leaning in to this discussion and having a hard look at some of the ugly history and the aftermath and the aftershocks of that ugly history, in the hopes to be able to do something different. It isn't, in my experience, it has not just been marginalized people and groups that have been coming to the table to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It has been white-led corporations and organizations that are saying, I want to do something to, I want to use and platform others that don't have the privilege and access that I've inherited by being a white person or in a majority culture, dominant culture in the United States. So yes, the great cause for concern, we definitely have to do better. And in some cases, we're not moving in the right direction. But I believe that, just like Tim said, in relation to the murder and the crisis and the tragedy of George Floyd's killing, and how it's sparked amongst the globe that maybe would not have had that if these things hadn't happened. It's terrible that we have to have 8 minutes and 46 seconds and burning cities and dead bodies to be able to have a conversation about the reality of injustice. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I think as a result of some of those horrific things that we've experienced over the last few years, that people are opening their eyes, opening their ears, and positioning their hearts to be able to receive a different message. And as Tim said, well, be willing to be made uncomfortable so that we can do something different and make some change.
If I could make a comment about leadership real quick, Adam. I've read all of Colin Powell's books that he's published, and one of the things that he says about leadership, and this thing I embrace wholeheartedly. He says either lead, follow, or get the hell out the way. And that's a truism. When I was in the military during the Vietnam era, I had a sergeant pull me aside and he says, Williams, he says, one day you may be in leadership position. I said, let me tell you something about leadership. He says, leadership is a very lonely position because you're going to do things that's going to piss a whole lot of people off. And he says, if you're going in leadership to make friends, then you're the wrong person to be in leadership. And he says, if you want a friend, get you a dog. And, that was in the 60s. And that lesson, that one-on-one lesson has transitioned to February 19, 2021. And it's the same edicts that are in place then or in place now. And I'm very hard on leadership. And I don't make any apology for that. Because if we had effective leadership, we wouldn't be having these conversations.
Well, in the few minutes we have left before we open it up to questions, I'd like to ask each of you to talk about any books, movies, podcasts, or other resources about some of the things we've talked about that you would recommend about bias and some of these other issues. Julian, do you want to go first?
Mr. Williams has a book called Deep Dive that if you have not checked it out, you definitely need to do that. There is a book by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt by the name of Bias that is absolutely excellent, that deals with some of these things. There's another book by the name of The Black and the Blue by Matthew Horace. He's a Black police officer who's been in the force for almost 30 years, I believe, and is having the conversation of the paradox of being a Black man as well as a Black man wearing the badge. Those are some great books that I would recommend, as well as if for those of you that have not seen the documentary, The 13th, that deals with the criminal justice system based on a book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. Absolutely a must read, and I would highly recommend it.
I like books on leadership. One of my favorite leaders, as I already talked about, is Colin Powell, and I like his books. I've read all of them. In fact, they're on the bookshelf behind me here. And also my book, A Deep Dive, an expert analysis of police procedure use supports and wrongful convictions. I do this on a daily basis. I'm going into my 46th year. So I have a little to say. I've seen a lot. And the movie that I really think that everyone should watch, especially when it comes to area of wrongful convictions and biases, Just Mercy. The movie is about Byron Stevenson. I believe that's his name. The one he has the Justice Initiative in Mobile, Alabama, and this is a story about a case that he handled in the deep rural South. And even though it has some historical perspectives, the same issues are going on today. And I think that I think it's important that I call it, we need to experience paradigm shifts. We need to make our own selves uncomfortable. I'm tired of going to courtrooms and just seeing the only Black person I'm seeing in there is me and the defendant. I went to, I had a case in Florida right down the road from Mar-a-Lago. And it was in those Southern courts, they have huge courtrooms. And they were arguing about keeping Tim Williams off the stand. Well, they lost that argument. And I walk into the courtroom, you can hear a pin drop on the carpet. Because they didn't think that Tim Williams was a Black man, because the DA last name was Williams. And he was white. And here I'm walking in. And the only person, other Black person that was in there was a juror. And I'm on the stand for 4 or 5 hours. And you know, these are things that the average person does not see, but I see on almost on a daily basis. Adam, you've done wrongful conviction work, and I've seen your work over the years. And you and I have worked together on some cases, and I would love to see some diversity in the fields that we're working in. You see, and we don't see that. So the thing is that there is discussions, there's broad discussions that need to be had. I think Julian did a masterful approach in bringing that into the criminal justice arena. And I think that in order to figure that you have a problem, you got to first of all agree that there is a problem. A Sojourner Truth stated that she would have freed more slaves if they knew they were slaves. You see, so the thing is that, you know, we've got to. And I'm glad for this discussion. I see there's some questions. The more I talk, the more questions are coming up, and which is good. But the thing is that I think that we need to not so much talk about it, but we need to be about it and be about change.
All right. Why don't we open it up to the floor and talk about and ask some questions. Actually, the first question we have is for Tim. What is the name of the book by the Black Panther that everybody had to read?
I can't remember what the name of the book was. There's several books out there by Black Panther. One of my favorite books was Seize These Times by Bobby Seale. And but it wasn't that one. It was written by a female Black Panther. And I can't remember the name of it.
Okay. So one of our viewers asked, what can the ordinary everyday citizen do other than seeing everyone in the community as an equal member of society or the community? It feels that until the wide bottom of the pyramid brings this to the top won't act. What are each of your reactions to that? What can everybody do?
I think it's really important for us to recognize that as we look at issues of injustice, there's the big and the small, there's the macro and the micro. And so when we see injustice as the ocean that it is, it feels insurmountable. What can I do as one person? I'm not an elected official. I'm not the head of a corporation. I'm not the chief of police. I'm not Julian Newman or Tim Williams. What can I do? But I really believe that when we see it just big picture, we can minimize the impact that we can have as a person. So there are 3 different things I always talk about with the groups that we work with. There's 3 components. There's learning that deals with our consciousness. There's living that deals with our relationships, and there's leading that deals with our influence. And all of us, whether we are the head of an organization or we are a soccer mom, we have the opportunity to do something in those 3 different areas. So what can I do? How can I act? If I'm the head of the PTA, what are some conversations that maybe we're not having? Do we have representation? If I'm in charge of a certain team or my church or my nonprofit, or maybe I'm the coach of a basketball squad. What does my team look like? What does my coaching staff look like? What can I do to take one step to bring influence? Maybe it's going to help somebody learn something. Maybe it's going to allow them to see the world a different way. Maybe I get my grandchild a different book for Christmas than maybe just a toy like last year. Maybe I have a conversation with their parents. And so again, there are systemic, structural, institutional monoliths and giants, Goliaths that we're dealing with. And we need to be able to speak truth to power. We need to have the opportunity to change how power moves going forward. But we cannot minimize the power of one person. We can't minimize the impact of one conversation, one documentary, one coffee discussion. And so we can't do everything. None of us can, but every one of us can do something. And so Tim, myself, we don't have the magic bullet, and we can't sit there and say, okay, if you do this thing, everything's going to transform, because these things have to fit your context and your environment and the world and position and place and space that you are. But every one of us can learn more than we did. Every one of us can live and navigate our relationships and expand the table, so to speak. And all of us can lead by influencing others in a way that creates a bigger and more beautiful world rather than a smaller one.
And Tim, what's your reaction?
Yeah, my answer, Adam, is I will go to the civic. I like to have a civic discussion. You know, when I say civics, you have to exercise your civic responsibility and vote. And you look at chiefs of police. They normally selected by the mayor, who the city council has to ratify the mayor's selection. And these are elected positions. And you've got to, the community has got to put the heat to their feet to make sure that what decisions they make are representative of the community's needs and concerns. Same way for the city council. You know, you got to make sure that the city council understands, because they come to the people every 2 to 4 years, depending on your jurisdiction. And they've got to understand that this is not a right. It's a privilege to serve. You don't have a right to be there. It's a privilege. And we want you to take care of our house being the community, and make sure you put square pegs in square holes. The same thing with the bench. You know, I get tired of looking down every time I get ready to vote. DA, who's running for a judge. And the thing is that, you know, there's other folk besides district attorneys that could be and should be judges. There is, you know, I've been around for a long time, and I've seen attorneys who are on the bench, private attorneys, public defenders, as well as district attorneys. A lot of them do very well. They make the transition very well. And a lot of them can't make the transition very well. And it's very evident in how they approach and how they deal with cases and how they deal with decisions. I've had judges who were DAs that I had to go to file cases, and they look at this stuff and the question is, what the hell's going on in the office? You understand what I'm saying? So the thing is that, you know, again, you got to be sure you get the right people. I took a training. I go to a death penalty conference every year, capital case, and one of the presenters was talking about the bench and how so much bad decisions are coming, and the appellate courts through habeas have to come back and clean up a whole bunch of mess. And then she jumped on the civic and the community. It says they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And I'm gonna quote her, vote their ass out of office. It's just that simple. And the thing is that it's Adam and I see this on a first-hand basis every day. And it's, it's like I testified in court the other day. Sometimes I get the impression folk just don't care. Just don't care. And otherwise, you would see different type of stuff coming to the courts. You see different type of cases being presented to the courts, and you will see a different type of investigation law enforcement work. And I'm getting the impression, and I've been going on this stuff going on 5 decades now. Sometimes I feel folk just don't care.
Well, is there something that can be done to make people care?
Well, yeah. Well, see, well, there are called lawsuits I've had 2 lawsuits where the law enforcement agencies have been sued, and guess who I saw on the lawsuit? The officers' wives, because they're taking away this immunity from them, and now they sue their estate. I've seen this twice, and this implied immunity for law enforcement. It's coming. It's slowly eroding, because now they're going after these officers' estates. And I have seen I'm not telling you what I've read and heard. I'm telling you what I've seen and analyzed, because they're my cases where the wives, with the officers' estate, their personal estate is on the line. And once you start having more of that, and I've been in law enforcement for almost 30 years, and these are the issues that you have to deal with. And if you are just don't care, or if you just don't care about the training or care about the laws, and do what you want to do, well, then there's ways of dealing with that. There's ways of dealing with that. Just I think a few years ago, prosecutorial misconduct is now a felonious type of a situation. They have pulled the DA away from that protection. Now you fool around and get involved in prosecutorial misconduct, you may be looking at criminal charges. So the thing is that you're starting there's starting to be meat being put on the bone, and for me saying that sometimes I feel that folks just don't care. You should never hear that from a professional, especially somebody who's been in law enforcement for 3 decades and been doing this stuff almost 5. You see, you should not want to hear
that. Julian, one of the questions is it possible to eliminate or...
Adam, I didn't get the last part of the question. Is it okay to eliminate or... I can't hear. Goodness. Tim, can you hear him?
No, I can't hear him. He's broken up at all.
Sorry.
Okay, there you go.
One of the questions put to us was, is it possible to eliminate or change an implicit bias?
I think the underlying is relationship. Implicit bias comes from the messages that we have. So I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, I was in I was a director of students in a small refinery town in California called Martinez. I grew up in Northern California in a mid-sized city, Sacramento. So I'm from Northern California originally. And so I met our students, and it's a predominantly white community. And I met them, and one of the kids had a really large cowboy hat on, big belt buckle, the boots, the whole thing. He looked like a cowboy. And as soon as I saw him, I didn't really like him. And I know that nobody on the call has ever met anybody that they didn't like when they first saw him, okay? Dislike at first sight. And so I didn't like him. And then later on, his mother reached out to me and began to share some of the challenges that were going on with him, as well as in the family. and how they really were looking for me to be super intentional about building a relationship that he could really improve in his studies and some other things. Well, before I could do that job effectively, I had to come to grips with my own issues and my own bias. And what I recognized is that this present situation was connected to a past pain and hurt. I went to a predominantly majority minority school. We had everybody there, but we went to a certain area of our city that was predominantly white. And on the bus, as the football team went out there were cowboys on horses, and they would yell racial things at us. And so here I was many years later, projecting on this young man the aftermath or the aftershocks of a negative experience that I had gone through, but I had not processed. And as a result of it, I was projecting it on him. And so at a point of self-evaluation, I began to recognize that I need to deal with this. This has nothing to do with him. This has everything to do with me. It's like the quote that says, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And so can we deal with implicit bias? Can we minimize it? Absolutely. But before we can minimize, before we can eliminate, before we can expand our cultural bandwidth as an individual or an organization by extension, I have to acknowledge it, because I can't fix what I don't face. And so it takes courage to do that, but absolutely we can change, we can get better, we can grow, we can minimize those things, and we can maximize our ability to navigate and to be able to see at a higher level.
So similarly, somebody else asked, if I notice implicit bias is occurring in my workplace or even within my family, how do I approach the situation?
Maybe the wrong way to approach it would be, let's just, it's a holiday dinner and a relative, Uncle Bob says something untoward, and you go ahead and let him know what time it is. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that confrontation doesn't have its place, but confrontation that isn't strategic or thoughtful almost always creates defensiveness. And then what it does is it ratchets up the emotion, and then we have a mess on our hands. One of the ways that we can do that is putting ourselves in a position of vulnerability ourselves. So for example, let's say Uncle Bob says something. And so the way to confront is to do it not, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, but could you that? That hasn't been my experience. And so by doing that, it puts me in the position of being a questioner rather than someone that is aggressively confronting. So that's one of the ways to be able to do that in the moment. If we're talking about the workplace and the workspace, we have to understand that racism, injustice, bias in a negative way is just the symptom of a greater problem. And so it isn't the issue, it's the symptom of a greater issue. The greater issue may be our policies and procedures are put in place by a dominant group where there were no other voices at the table. A greater issue may be that we put these policies and procedures in place, and maybe we had other people at the table, but there's no feedback loop to assess and create an atmosphere of accountability to find out if the policies and procedures we put in place are actually doing their job. And so I would say that creating spaces to have conversations, to assess what we're doing and how we're doing it. If we deal with every issue of bias, and again, there's nothing wrong with confronting racism, bias, injustice, dehumanization, minimizing in the moment. I'm not saying not to do that. I'm just saying that if that's all we do, and we deal with the instances, but we don't address the system that creates the atmosphere where the instances come from, then that's all we'll be doing. And so understand, as we address, we confront, we navigate, we engage, always keep in mind our own propensity to get it wrong too. That's something that really helps me, because I have definitely been on the wrong side of bias, racism. I have been perpetrated against. But I just shared a story where I got it wrong. And a guy that had been perpetrated against many times had put himself or allowed himself to be in a space and place where I was the perpetrator. And so I know I'm fully aware of my capacity to get it wrong. And I carry that awareness with me as I help try to guide individuals, organizations, companies, and corporations in a pathway to operate and lead and influence at a higher level. That's what I would say in response to how you deal with some of that.
And Tim, what's the best way in a police department? What's the best way to handle it if you observe bias and instances of bias in your own department?
Well, you bring it. There are resources or recourses that you can do. You bring it up to the supervisor. You bring it up to management. But in law enforcement and those who may be listening to this discussion that they have been in law enforcement, they will tell you, not tell you, it doesn't work. What works is you got to put square pegs in square holes. And until you learn how to do that, you're going to have institutional problems where you're going to cause your employees to go out and sue the department or the agency to right the wrongs that have been done. There was 2 lawsuits that emanated from LAPD. One was a Franchon Blake lawsuit. It was females. I mean, she sued after she left the department. But the thing was that they were relegating women to working juvenile, and they weren't promoting them. And to the point where the lawsuit, you had 2 lists. You had a list were the regular list, and you had a list for the women. And so to try to make up for the errors of the past. And you look at individuals, the females that are in high-ranking positions today on the department. If it wasn't for Franchon Blake, they wouldn't be there, period. Because there were a lot of females that were as sharp as them, or perhaps even sharper, that never got the opportunity. Then you look at the Hunter LaLaye lawsuit, where Blacks weren't being promoted to detective supervisors positions and senior detective supervisor positions. When I came onto the department, there was, I think we had 13 senior detective supervisors. And then when I left the department, I think you had 15 or 16 senior detective supervisors. When 30 years, all you can do is 3. Is 3, really? So the thing is that that lawsuit allowed or gave Blacks opportunity to promote into supervisory positions, not only Blacks, but Asian and Hispanic and females to promote into supervisory positions in the detective ranks. But the thing is that there has to be a cultural change within the organization. I remember when I was working in the Watts area, Southeast Division, that covers the Watts area, and they had narcotics investigations going on. Well, the white senior detective supervisors were sitting in a squad room with their feet up on the desk, and the Blacks, who weren't assigned to them, but they were on loan, were out there doing the work and putting their lives on the line. And to the point where one officer, I investigated his case, he had a gun pointed on him or to his chest. And the only reason why he lived, because the slide, the semi-automatic was pointed and engaged the slide. And when they tried to shoot, the round wouldn't go off. And he had to jump off a 2nd floor balcony to survive. And the thing is that they would, and I told him, I said, you got to make a decision in your career. As long as you're being rented, they're going to rent you. They need to hire you. and it was just that it was white folk in charge and put black folk out there to risk their lives, but they weren't hiring them in the positions. They would put them on loan. And I terminated. I liken that to renting a black to do your job and not getting them in, not hiring them in the position. So again, there's got to be some changes. And the community, a lot of the community they're not even aware of what blacks deal with. When I say blacks, blacks in law enforcement deal with within the organization. And then what you see out there in the community is the same thing you see in law enforcement organizations, because the same people that you see in the community are the same folk that are hired in law enforcement organizations. And until the culture changes, you're going to see the same problems.
Julian, one of our viewers asked, is there a thorough resource that I can use to take inventory or assessment of the biases of educators?
We do that at Culture Creative, and so if they wanted to reach out to us and have a greater conversation about that, that would be great. So yeah, we do a lot of work with the education industry. So that's a quick answer.
Okay. Tim, one of the viewers said that they were on a jury some years ago and they could tell from the jury box that the investigation wasn't thorough enough probably to have identified the right person to put on trial. And they asked, what has to happen for a case to be reopened after a conviction?
Well, that person, the defendant, will have to go through and try for or try to get or sue for get an attorney to get him or her a new case. I believe is a habeas relief. Is that right, Adam? And so you have to go through that route. And it's a long process because you got to go through it. You got to pull up all the reports. You got to pull all the court transcripts. You got to pull up all the exhibits. You got to pull, everything that was involved in the case. You got to pull up. The attorney has to get, you may have to get a DNA expert. You may have to get a police procedure expert like myself. You may have to, different types of experts have to look at the case and help the attorney put the case together. And that's what has to be done. The thing is that the second thing, the juror could have voted their conscience. And I sat on a jury about 3 or 4 years after I retired. Well, my wife was at that time a director in the district attorney's office. And in the position she held at that time, she had offices in every courthouse in the county, and her name was on the door. The judge that was there used to work for my wife. So I laid all that stuff out. Come to find out both sides wanted me. So I sat on the jury, and I think everyone should have that experience. Attorneys, judges, everybody should have that experience. The hours that you spend trying to put jury instructions together, you're wasting your time, so to speak. I got in the jury room. I was a foreperson. And we got in the jury room, and they were talking about, it was a criminal case. They were talking about everything but what had happened during the course of that trial. I pulled out one jury instruction called a doubt. To me, if there's a doubt that's where the person was, the person is involved in the case, then the instruction reads that you shall find the defendant not guilty. So a reasonable doubt, that is. So we went. I did a pool, and they were finding the defendant guilty. Then we had a discussion. Then I pulled out that reasonable doubt jury instructions. Then they said, wait a minute. Yeah, there were some questions we had. There's some doubt here. And so I asked for another vote, and everyone to the person voted not guilty because of reasonable doubt. The investigation was poor. the DA and the defense attorney, the public defender, were both young, and so the detective who was supposed to be sitting there next to the DA wasn't even there during the course of the trial, and so we found the defendant not guilty in about 45 minutes. Both attorneys wanted to talk to me after the trial, so I sat down and talked to both both of them, giving them my experience. And I told the DA, you always have your investigating officer sit next to you during the course of the trial. I mean, they have to stand up and support their work. They need to be there. And I gave some instructions or some counsel to the public defender based upon my years of experience. I can't tell an attorney how to be an attorney. I've never been to law school. So the thing is that, I give them from based on my experience. So the thing was, I think that you've got to vote your conscience. That's what you've got to do. If you feel that the defendant is now guilty, well, you hang that jury and defendant's not guilty. When you hang the jury, either the district attorney will make a decision, well, I don't want to be going through this again, via her supervisor, his or her supervisor, or we'll go through it again. You see, but this is what you've got to do, and you've got to vote your conscience. You've got to vote right in that jury room.
All right. Well, we have about 3 minutes left, and I wondered if each of you wanted to just make express any closing thoughts. Julian, do you want to start?
First of all, thank you for hosting this and for moderating and guiding us, Adam. Thank you so much for doing that. It's a real joy to be able to have this conversation. Thank you, Tim, for allowing me to team with you today. I think the thing that I would just want everyone to know is we all have power to bring change. Not all of us can change everything, but like I said earlier, all of us can do something. And so this is a difficult discussion. I've seen some of the things that people have said and commented, and it's easy to lose hope. But don't just observe. I think it was Congressman Lewis that said, get in good trouble, and not to be overcome with despair. And so I really would want us to, in the midst of everything that's going on, the challenges, post-pandemic, all the stuff that we're dealing with right now, we all have the power to make change. And in our little corner of this planet, we can help make it more beautiful. And if all of us do that.
All right. How are you going to top that, Tim?
Well, all I can do is sit at his feet and bask in his shadow. I just want to thank you, Adam, and Julian for being a part of this meaningful discussion. The thing is that I'm, as I said earlier, I'm leadership driven, and I'm hard on leadership, and I would love to see effective leadership. If you have effective leadership, a lot of these problems would take care of themselves, because leaders wouldn't be afraid to call and make the hard decisions. And the thing is, for those of you who are listening that may be in law enforcement or maybe in leadership positions, you've got to, you can't be on the sidelines. You got to be in the mix. It was easy for me to retire and sit back and do nothing. But it was a mandate, but it was my core value that wanted me to stay in this business and to make a difference. If I can make a difference and help one person, just one person, then I have been successful, because it's like the old Temptation song, like the snowball rolling down the side of a hill. As the snowball rolls down, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That one person will reach out and touch somebody else. And those people will reach out and touch 4 people. And then the number goes on and on and on. But there has to be a beginning. there has to be a beginning. You know, there's got to be Tim Williams out there that are willing to do that. There's got to be Julian Newmans out there that are willing to do that. And there's got to be Adam Grants out there willing to do that. We got to stop being spectators. That's the easy way out. But we got to get in the game.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody who's watching. Thank you so much to our experts. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today. And hopefully we'll have another conversation soon. So thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.